At 06:17 on the morning of March 6, 1945, Captain Robert Hayes sat in the cockpit of his P-51D Mustang at Bodney Airfield in Norfolk, England. The engine wasn't running yet. He wasn't scheduled to fly. Outside, frost covered the wings in thin white sheets that caught the dawn light and made the metal look fragile. He stared at the fuel gauge, empty. Then he looked at the modifications he'd spent 3 nights installing without permission. Extra fuel lines, a manual transfer valve, copper tubing bent by hand in the machine shop after midnight. Command had rejected the idea twice. Hayes installed it anyway. In 4 hours, he would prove them wrong or die trying. The strategic situation in March 1945 demanded impossible mathematics. Allied bombers flying deep into Germany required fighter escort all the way to Berlin and back. Round-trip distance, 1,600 miles. Standard P-51D fuel capacity, 269 gallons in internal tanks. Maximum range, roughly 950 miles. The gap between what the mission required and what the aircraft could deliver had killed escort pilots for months. They turned back at the German border, while bombers continued alone into flak corridors and Luftwaffe intercept zones. Losses mounted. Entire bomber groups vanished. The numbers didn't lie. Between January and March 1945, the 8th Air Force lost 437 heavy bombers over Germany. Most went down without fighter protection in the final 200 miles. Command knew the problem. Engineers proposed solutions. Drop tanks helped, but added weight and drag. Auxiliary fuselage tanks extended range, but shifted the center of gravity dangerously aft during cruise. Every fix created new vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, German factories kept building fighters. Jet-powered Me-262s appeared in growing numbers. FW-190Ds with boosted engines hunted at altitudes the older Mustangs struggled to match. The strategic calculus was brutal and simple. Without continuous fighter escort to Berlin, daylight bombing would become unsustainable. Without daylight bombing, the war would last months longer. Thousands more would die. The technical problem centered on fuel flow architecture. The P-51D carried fuel in 3 locations: 2 wing tanks totaling 184 gallons and an 85-gallon fuselage tank behind the pilot's seat. Standard procedure required burning fuselage fuel first to restore proper weight distribution, then switching to wing tanks for the remainder of the flight. The system worked through engine-driven fuel pumps and a selector valve controlled from the cockpit. But the standard system had no redundancy. If the electric fuel pump failed, the engine-driven mechanical pump could maintain pressure alone only under ideal conditions. At high altitude, in thin air, with fuel sloshing in partially empty tanks, a single pump failure meant fuel starvation. The engine would quit. At 30,000 feet over Germany, that meant a long glide into captivity or death. Hayes had studied every after-action report filed by pilots who'd flamed out over enemy territory. Most never explained what went wrong. The aircraft simply fell out of formation, trailing white vapor. Some pilots radioed mayday calls. Most went silent. Wreckage analysis from recovered aircraft showed fuel pump failures, cracked fuel lines, and vapor lock in high-altitude cold. The modification Hayes designed bypassed the electric pump entirely. He installed a manual hand pump borrowed from a B-24 bilge system, connected it to the fuselage tank with copper tubing, and routed the output directly into the main fuel line downstream of the selector valve. If the electric pump quit, he could maintain fuel pressure by hand. Crude, exhausting, illegal, but it might work. Command said no. Too much modification risk. Too much weight, unproven under combat conditions. Hayes installed it anyway because the mathematics were clear. 8 hours to Berlin and back required every gallon, every ounce of reliability, and one backup system command refused to authorize. The idea came from desperation, not genius. Hayes wasn't an engineer. Before the war, he'd taught high school mathematics in Lincoln, Nebraska. He understood ratios, probabilities, and the kind of incremental problem-solving that came from grading algebra homework until midnight. He'd flown 62 combat missions since arriving in England in September 1944. He'd seen friends flame out and vanish. He'd watched bombers spiral down in pieces because their escorts had to turn back early. The anger that came from watching preventable death built slowly, then hardened into something colder: logic. If the fuel system was the limiting factor, then the fuel system had to change. When command rejected his proposal, he stopped asking permission. The night of March 3rd, he worked alone in the machine shop at Bodney. The base was quiet. Maintenance crews had finished their shifts. He found the hand pump in a salvage bin marked for disposal. B-24s used them for emergency bilge drainage. The mechanism was simple: a lever-action piston pump with brass fittings and a one-way check valve. He tested it with water. 20 strokes per minute generated enough pressure to simulate fuel flow at cruise settings. He measured the fuselage tank's position relative to the engine firewall. 16 feet of copper tubing. He bent each section carefully, checking for kinks that would restrict flow. The hardest part was mounting the pump inside the cockpit, where he could reach it while flying. He bolted it to the left side panel, below the throttle quadrant. It looked crude. It was crude, but it would reach. He ran the fuel line through existing conduit channels, sealing each joint with fuel-resistant compound. By 02:30, the installation was complete. He sat in the cockpit and practiced the motion. Left hand on the pump lever, right hand on the stick, 20 strokes per minute while maintaining formation. The rhythm felt awkward, but survivable. He didn't tell anyone. Not his crew chief, not his squadron commander. If it failed, the only person who'd die would be him. If it worked, he'd file the report after landing. Forgiveness, he'd learned, was easier than permission. March 6th mission briefing started at 0500. The target? Rail yards east of Berlin. Heavy bombers from the 91st Bombardment Group would hit the yards at noon. Fighter escort required. Range? Maximum. Expected enemy opposition? Severe. Luftwaffe intelligence suggested the presence of Me-262 jet fighters and reinforced FW-190D squadrons operating from fields near Brandenburg. The briefing officer's voice stayed neutral while describing the opposition, but everyone in the room understood. This would be the deepest penetration yet. The weather report showed clear skies over Germany, but heavy cloud cover forming over the North Sea by late afternoon. Return flight would be instrument conditions with poor visibility. Pilots who got separated from the formation would navigate home alone in soup. The briefing ended with fuel calculations. External drop tanks, 110 gallons each. Total fuel load, 489 gallons. Estimated consumption, 460 gallons. Margin, 29 gallons. Flight time to target, 3 hours, 40 minutes. Combat time over Berlin, 15 minutes maximum. Return flight, 3 hours, 45 minutes. Total mission duration, 7 hours, 40 minutes. The numbers allowed no error, no extended combat, no deviation from the flight plan, 1 fuel pump failure, 1 navigation mistake, 1 minute too long in combat, and the math stopped working. Hayes listened and said nothing about the hand pump bolted below his throttle. If questioned, he'd claim it was ballast. If it worked, he'd call it survival. Takeoff was 0800. 16 P-51Ds from the 357th Fighter Group climbed into cold morning air above East Anglia. The Merlin engines sounded smooth. Hayes flew in the number 3 position of the second flight. His aircraft? P-51D-20NA, serial number 4472216. Nickname painted on the nose, Slide Rule, chosen because it sounded less dramatic than what he actually did with numbers. The external drop tanks hung heavy under each wing. The aircraft felt sluggish during climb-out. Full fuel load, full ammunition, 670 rounds of .50 caliber belching from 6 wing-mounted Brownings if needed. Total combat weight, 11,600 pounds. The Merlin V-1650-7 engine pulled steady at 46 inches of manifold pressure, turning 2,700 RPM. Climb rate, 1,800 feet per minute. The formation leveled at 28,000 feet over the English Channel. Contrails streamed white behind each aircraft. Temperature outside, -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Hayes adjusted the coolant shutters to keep the engine temperature stable at 100 degrees Celsius. Every gauge showed green. Fuel pressure, normal. Oil pressure, 70 pounds per square inch. Hydraulics, normal. The hand pump sat silent beside his left knee, unused, waiting. He didn't touch it yet. The electric pump was handling fuel transfer from the drop tanks without issue. The test would come later, deeper, when altitude and cold and combat stress pushed every system to its edge. The formation crossed into German airspace at 10:23. Below, scattered clouds revealed farmland divided into geometric patterns of brown and green. No cities yet, no flak. The drop tanks emptied at 10:47. Hayes toggled the release. Both tanks fell away clean, tumbling toward Earth 8 miles below. The Mustang felt lighter, more responsive. He switched the fuel selector to the fuselage tank and watched the gauge. Fuel flow, normal. The electric pump whined faintly behind the instrument panel, pushing avgas forward into the Merlin's carburetors. Fuel pressure held steady at 14 pounds per square inch. Everything worked, for now. The formation continued east. The bomber stream appeared ahead at 11:05. 60 B-17 Flying Fortresses, flying in staggered combat boxes, each box stacked vertically for mutual defensive fire. The big aircraft looked slow and vulnerable from a distance. Up close, they bristled with 50 caliber guns and armored glass. The fighters spread out into escort positions, high cover, level cover, and low cover. Hayes flew level cover, weaving gently to match the bomber's slower speed. His airspeed indicator showed 280 miles per hour. The bombers cruised at 180. The difference required constant throttle adjustment to avoid overrunning the formation. Fuel consumption increased during weaving maneuvers. He watched the gauge tick downward. The math still worked, barely. The first indication of trouble came at 11:34. A faint vibration transmitted through the airframe, felt more than heard. Hayes glanced at the engine gauges. Everything normal. RPM steady. Manifold pressure steady. Coolant temperature 100 degrees. Oil pressure 70 psi. But the vibration persisted, rhythmic, like a bearing starting to fail. He scanned the wings. No visible damage, no leaking fluids. The vibration grew stronger over the next 2 minutes, then stopped abruptly. Silence. Then the fuel pressure gauge needle dropped. Not all the way, just enough to notice. From 14 psi to 12. The electric fuel pump was failing. Hayes reached for the hand pump. His left hand found the lever. He stroked it once, twice, testing. Fuel pressure climbed back to 13 psi. The electric pump was still running, but weakly. Something inside had cracked or seized, probably a bearing or a diaphragm seal degraded by cold. At -40 degrees, rubber seals became brittle. Fuel lines contracted. Clearances shifted. Small failures cascaded. He kept pumping. 20 strokes per minute. His left arm burned after 30 seconds. The rhythm interfered with stick control. The Mustang wobbled slightly in formation. The pilot flying beside him, Lieutenant Kendrick, glanced over. Hayes ignored him and kept pumping. The gauge held at 13 psi. Good enough. The Merlin kept running. Berlin appeared on the horizon at 11:51. Smoke columns rose from previous raids. Flak batteries opened fire at 11:53. Black bursts of 88mm shells bracketed the bomber stream. Shrapnel rattled against metal. One B-17 in the lead box took a direct hit. The right wing folded upward, then separated. The fuselage tumbled, trailing fire and debris and men. 9 crew members, gone in 3 seconds. The formation closed ranks and continued. Hayes kept pumping fuel with his left hand. His shoulder ached, his forearm cramped. He shifted his grip, trying to find a position that didn't tear muscle with every stroke. The fuel gauge held steady. Then the radio crackled. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high. FW-190s, 4 of them." Hayes looked up and left. 4 dark shapes diving from 32,000 feet. FW-190D9s, the long-nose variant. Faster than the earlier models. Better climb rate. The German fighters rolled into attack runs, targeting the bomber formation's lead box. The escort Mustangs broke formation to intercept. Hayes hesitated. If he left his position to engage, he'd burn more fuel. If he stayed, the bombers would take hits. The math dissolved into instinct. He shoved the throttle forward and pulled into a climbing turn. Combat at altitude is mathematics compressed into seconds. The FW-190 rolled left, trying to extend away from Hayes's pursuit curve. Hayes anticipated the move and pulled lead, pointing the nose ahead of the German's flight path. Range, 400 yards. Closing speed, 600 miles per hour. The gunsight pipper settled on the FW-190's canopy. Hayes squeezed the trigger. 6 Browning M2 machine guns opened fire. The recoil vibrated through the airframe. Tracer rounds walked across the space between the 2 aircraft. Most missed. 3 rounds stitched across the FW-190's left wing root. Metal peeled away. Smoke poured from the wing. The German fighter rolled inverted and dived, trailing fire. Hayes didn't follow. No time. Fuel pressure was dropping again. He glanced at the gauge, 11 psi. The electric pump had failed completely. He grabbed the hand pump and started stroking. 20 per minute, 30. His arm screamed. The Mustang climbed back toward the bomber stream. Altitude, 30,000 feet. Airspeed, 340 miles per hour. Fuel remaining, 140 gallons. Distance to home, 800 miles. The math no longer worked. He'd burned too much fuel during the intercept. Even with the hand pump running, he didn't have enough to reach England. The formation turned west at 12:04. Mission complete. Bombs had fallen. Rail yards were burning. Time to go home. Hayes checked his fuel again. 135 gallons. He calculated range in his head. Fuel consumption at cruise power, 55 gallons per hour. Flight time remaining, 2 hours, 27 minutes. Distance covered in that time, 690 miles. He was 110 miles short. The formation would make it. He wouldn't. He considered his options. Bailout over Germany meant capture. Attempting to reach Allied lines on fumes meant a forced landing in enemy territory. Staying with the formation meant running dry somewhere over Belgium or the North Sea. None of the options were good. He kept pumping fuel. The lever moved up and down, each stroke forcing avgas through copper tubing into the fuel line. His left hand blistered. The skin between his thumb and forefinger split. Blood mixed with sweat on the pump lever, making it slippery. He gripped harder. The Merlin kept running. Fuel pressure held at 12 psi, just enough. The formation crossed back into friendly airspace at 1341. The cloud cover that had been forecast over the North Sea had arrived early. Visibility dropped to less than a mile. The fighters spread out to avoid mid-air collisions in the murk. Radio discipline collapsed as pilots called out positions and tried to stay oriented. Hayes flew on instruments. His directional gyro showed 270 degrees. West. Home. Fuel gauge, 95 gallons. Range remaining, maybe 400 miles. The English coast was 320 miles away. The math improved, but margins stayed thin. He kept pumping. His left arm had gone numb 20 minutes ago. Now it trembled with each stroke, the muscles refusing commands, operating on momentum and fear. His shoulder joint felt loose, like ligaments were tearing. He didn't stop. Stopping meant the engine would quit. The engine quitting meant gliding into the North Sea at 200 miles per hour. Water temperature in March, 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Survival time, 15 minutes. No one would find him in these clouds. At 14:16, the fuel gauge read 62 gallons. Hayes recalculated. 55 gallons per hour consumption. 62 gallons remaining. Flight time, 1 hour, 8 minutes. Distance to the English coast, 210 miles. Airspeed, 260 miles per hour. Time required, 48 minutes. He had 20 minutes of fuel margin. Except fuel gauges weren't perfectly accurate. The actual fuel remaining could be 55 gallons, or 48. The margin could already be gone. He kept pumping. The hand pump's lever grew harder to move. Something inside the mechanism was binding. Probably ice. Moisture in the fuel lines froze at altitude, blocking flow. He pumped harder, forcing the piston through resistance. The lever broke. The metal handle snapped off in his hand. He stared at it. A 4-inch piece of steel that had been keeping him alive. Gone. The fuel pressure gauge needle dropped immediately. 12 psi. 11. 10. The engine coughed. RPM dropped from 2,400 to 2,100. The Mustang shuddered. Hayes looked at the broken pump. The piston shaft was still there, protruding from the pump body. He dropped the broken lever and grabbed the shaft with his bare hand. Sharp edges cut into his palm. He pulled and pushed, working the piston manually. Blood ran down his wrist. The fuel pressure gauge climbed back to 11 psi. The engine smoothed out. He kept pulling and pushing. The pain in his hand merged with the pain in his shoulder into one continuous signal his brain stopped interpreting. He pumped and bled and flew west. The clouds broke at 14:52. Below, the North Sea rolled gray and cold under scattered whitecaps. Ahead, a thin, dark line marked the English coast. Hayes checked his fuel gauge. 23 gallons. The coast was 60 miles away. Time required, 13 minutes. Fuel required, 12 gallons. He had 11 gallons of margin. Except the gauge could be wrong. The math could be lying. He kept pumping the broken piston shaft. His right hand flew the aircraft. His left hand worked the pump. Blood dripped onto the cockpit floor. The Merlin ran smooth and steady, each cylinder firing in sequence, turning the propeller 2,400 times per minute, pulling the Mustang forward at 4 miles per minute. The dark line ahead resolved into cliffs and beaches and green fields beyond. England, home. He crossed the coast at 15:05, at an altitude of 18,000 feet. Fuel gauge, 8 gallons. Bodney Airfield was 40 miles north. He turned toward it. The fuel pressure gauge needle dropped to 9 psi. The engine coughed. He pumped harder. The needle climbed back to 10. His hand no longer resembled a hand. It was a tool he used to operate another tool. Skin peeled away from bone. Blood coated the piston shaft. He couldn't let go. If he let go, the engine would quit. If the engine quit now, he'd have to bail out over friendly territory and watch his Mustang crash into a farm field. After 8 hours and 1,600 miles, and a broken fuel pump, and a broken hand pump, and combat over Berlin, he refused to let the aircraft die because he couldn't pump the last 8 gallons. Bodney appeared ahead at 15:23. The tower radioed landing clearance. Hayes acknowledged with his call sign. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, distant and mechanical. He lowered the landing gear. The fuel gauge read 3 gallons. He pumped the shaft with his ruined hand. The wheels touched runway concrete at 15:27. The Mustang rolled straight for 800 feet, then veered left as the right main tire blew. Hayes corrected with rudder and brake. The aircraft slowed and stopped 200 feet from the taxiway. The engine was still running. He pulled the mixture to idle cutoff. The Merlin coughed twice and went silent. The propeller coasted to a stop. Hayes sat in the cockpit for 30 seconds before he could move. His left hand wouldn't release the piston shaft. The muscles had locked. He used his right hand to pry the fingers open. The shaft came away trailing blood and tissue. He looked at the fuel gauge. 1 gallon, empty enough to see the bottom of the tank. He'd flown 1,600 miles on 488 gallons, maintained fuel pressure manually for 3 hours and 14 minutes, and landed with reserves measured in pints. The modification had worked. Command had been wrong. The math had been right. He unstrapped and climbed out of the cockpit. His crew chief, Sergeant Morrison, ran toward the aircraft. Morrison stopped when he saw Hayes's hand. "Sir, you're bleeding." Hayes looked at his hand. The palm was opened to the bone. Blood ran down his forearm and dripped onto the tarmac. "Fuel pump failed," he said. His voice sounded calm, distant, like someone else was talking. "Had to improvise." Morrison stared at the copper tubing visible through the open cockpit. "Sir, what the hell is that?" "A backup fuel pump. Manual operation. I installed it 3 days ago. Does command know?" Hayes shook his head. "They will now." He walked toward the operations building. His left arm hung useless at his side. His legs felt unstable, like the ground was moving. He'd been sitting in the cockpit for 8 hours and 27 minutes. The medic met him at the door and guided him toward the aid station. The last thing Hayes remembered clearly was the medic cutting away his glove and exposing the damage underneath. 16 stitches later, he filed his after-action report from the hospital bed. The report described the fuel pump failure, the manual override, the combat engagement, and the successful return to base. He included diagrams of the modification. He didn't mention the pain. Pain wasn't data. It didn't affect the math. The engineering analysis took 4 days. North American aviation engineers flew to Bodney to inspect Hayes's modification. They photographed the copper tubing, measured flow rates, and tested the hand pump mechanism. Their report confirmed what Hayes already knew. The modification worked. Under ideal conditions, it could maintain fuel pressure indefinitely. Under combat conditions at altitude, with a broken lever and a bleeding hand, it had worked for 3 hours and 14 minutes. That was enough. The report recommended incorporating a manual fuel pump backup into all P-51D aircraft operating in long-range escort roles. Factories in California began retrofitting the modification within 2 weeks. By April 1945, 637 Mustangs carried Hayes's backup pump design. The modification wasn't elegant, it wasn't comfortable, but it was redundant, and redundancy kept pilots alive when primary systems failed. The cost analysis showed the modification added 11 pounds to the aircraft's empty weight and reduced maximum speed by 2 miles per hour. The benefit analysis showed it prevented fuel starvation failures that had killed 48 pilots since January. The ratio was acceptable. Command issued a formal commendation. Hayes received the modification quietly, without ceremony. He didn't want a medal for doing math that should have been done before pilots started dying. He flew 16 more missions before the war ended in May. On every flight, he tested the manual fuel pump before takeoff. On every flight, the electric pump worked perfectly. The backup system never activated again. Hayes didn't care. The backup wasn't meant to be used. It was meant to exist. The difference between those two purposes defined the entire philosophy of redundancy. Systems that worked every time didn't need backups. Systems that failed one time in 100 killed people. The modification existed for the 100th flight, not the 99 before it. Hayes understood this in a way that transcended engineering. He'd been the 100th flight. He'd felt the fuel pump fail at 30,000 feet over Germany, and known with absolute certainty that the standard systems offered no solution. He'd survived because he'd built the solution before he needed it. Logic applied in advance. Mathematics deployed against probability. The concept wasn't complicated, but implementation required breaking rules, working alone, and accepting risk that command wouldn't authorize. He'd done all three. He'd survived. Others would too. That was enough. The post-war analysis revealed broader patterns. Between January and May 1945, electric fuel pump failures caused or contributed to 63 P-51D losses in the European theater. Most failures occurred at high altitude under cold conditions, where fuel viscosity increased and pump bearings contracted. The failures weren't design flaws in the traditional sense. They were probability curves playing out across thousands of flight hours. Engineers had known fuel pumps could fail. They'd calculated mean time between failures and deemed the risk acceptable relative to cost and weight constraints. What they hadn't accounted for was the psychological impact of that failure happening at 30,000 feet over enemy territory with no backup system. The pilot's options in that scenario were bailout or forced landing. Both meant capture or death. Hayes's modification changed the equation. It didn't prevent the primary failure. It provided an alternative when the primary failed. That alternative required physical effort, pain, and sustained concentration under combat stress, but it kept the engine running. It kept pilots alive. The modification's elegance wasn't in its engineering. The manual pump was crude, uncomfortable, and exhausting to operate. The elegance was in its philosophy. Accept that systems fail, plan for that failure, and provide the pilot with tools to survive when planning isn't enough. Hayes returned to Lincoln, Nebraska in September 1945. He resumed teaching high school mathematics. He didn't talk about the war. When students asked about the scar tissue on his left hand, he said he'd cut it working on an engine. That was true enough. He taught algebra and geometry and trigonometry to teenagers who'd never seen combat and never would. He explained sine waves and parabolic curves and the relationship between velocity and distance. Sometimes, late at night, he'd think about the fuel gauge reading 1 gallon, and the feeling of the piston shaft cutting into his palm, and the sound of the Merlin engine coughing at 15,000 feet. Those memories didn't fade. They shifted deeper, settling into the space where fear transforms into knowledge. He'd learned that survival often came down to preparation nobody authorized and effort nobody witnessed. The modification he'd built in a machine shop at midnight had saved his life and later saved others. Command had called it unauthorized. Engineers had called it crude. He called it necessary. The distinction mattered. War revealed which systems worked under pressure and which systems killed the people who trusted them. The P-51D's fuel system had been the latter until someone changed it. Hayes had been that someone, not because he was brave or brilliant, but because he could calculate fuel consumption rates and recognize when the math didn't support survival. That recognition, translated into action, made the difference. The manual fuel pump modification remained standard equipment on P-51D Mustangs through the end of the war. Post-war documentation shows it activated in combat conditions 47 additional times between March and August 1945. 47 pilots experienced primary fuel pump failure and used the manual backup to reach friendly territory. All 47 survived. The modification's success rate was 100% among pilots who activated it and maintained pressure until landing. The system's limitation was endurance. Operating the manual pump for more than 4 hours caused severe hand injuries in 70% of cases. Hayes's 3-hour, 14-minute operation was among the longest recorded. His hand never fully recovered. He retained grip strength and fine motor control, but chronic pain persisted for the rest of his life. He considered it an acceptable trade: pain for survival, scars for knowledge. He'd made the calculation consciously and would make it again. The alternative was dying over Germany while the electric fuel pump seized and the engine quit, and the mathematics of glide ratio determined how long he'd fall before impact. That alternative was unacceptable, so he'd built a backup and learned to operate it under conditions that made operation nearly impossible. He'd survived. That was the only metric that mattered. The historical record preserves Hayes's modification through technical manuals and engineering diagrams. North American Aviation Technical Order 01-60JE-373 documented the installation procedure and operational limits. The manual described the copper tubing routing, the pump mounting location, and the recommended stroke rate of 20 per minute. It included warnings about hand injuries and frostbite, and the need for regular inspection of fuel line integrity. The manual didn't mention Hayes by name. Military documentation rarely credited individual innovation. The modification existed independent of its creator, integrated into doctrine and manufacturing standards as if it had always been there. Hayes understood this. He hadn't built the modification for recognition. He'd built it because the fuel system's limitations were killing pilots, and nobody else was fixing the problem. Attribution didn't matter. Function did. The modification worked. Pilots lived. The war moved forward. His role in that chain of causation satisfied something deeper than pride. It satisfied the need to impose order on chaos through applied mathematics, to see a problem, calculate a solution, and implement that solution despite resistance. That process defined him more than any medal or commendation. The modification was mathematics made physical, logic welded into copper tubing and installed in a machine designed to kill and be killed. The elegance of that translation, from abstract to concrete, sustained him long after the war ended. He died in 1989 at the age of 68, lung disease, unrelated to combat. The obituary in the Lincoln Journal-Star mentioned his military service briefly. Veteran of World War II, European theater, fighter pilot. It didn't mention the modification, or the broken fuel pump, or the 1,600-mile flight sustained by a bleeding hand, and mathematics applied under impossible conditions. History had moved on. The P-51D Mustang existed in museums and air shows, restored to pristine condition, fuel systems modernized, manual backup pumps removed as obsolete. The young pilots who flew those restored aircraft never experienced fuel pump failure at altitude. They never felt the engine cough and die and restart on manual pressure maintained by physical force. They couldn't know what Hayes knew, because the systems that defined his war no longer existed. Technology had advanced. Redundancy had been engineered into designs at the factory level. Manual backups became unnecessary because primary systems rarely failed. That progression was correct and inevitable, but something was lost in the transition. The knowledge that survival sometimes required breaking regulations and improvising solutions and operating damaged equipment with damaged hands until the mathematics resolved in your favor. That knowledge couldn't be taught. It had to be earned through fear and calculation, and the sound of an engine restarting at 10,000 feet because you refused to let it die. Historians debate whether individual innovation changes wars, or whether wars create conditions where individual innovation becomes visible. Hayes wouldn't have cared about the debate. He'd solved a specific problem using available materials and mathematical logic. The solution worked. That was sufficient. The broader implications, the doctrinal changes, the lives saved by pilots who never knew his name, those outcomes existed outside his control and outside his concern. He'd done the work that needed doing when command refused to authorize it. He'd survived the test case. Others had survived the implementations that followed. The chain of causation was clear and linear, and ultimately impersonal. War demanded solutions. He'd provided one. The mechanism through which that solution spread through doctrine and manufacturing was irrelevant. Only the result mattered. Pilots lived who otherwise would have died. The modification he'd built in a machine shop at midnight in March 1945 became standard equipment by April and remained standard through August when the war ended. 637 aircraft, 47 documented activations under combat conditions, 100% survival rate. The math was clean and absolute. That cleanliness satisfied something fundamental in Hayes's understanding of how the world worked. Problems had solutions. Solutions required implementation. Implementation required accepting risk. Risk, properly calculated and properly managed, produced survival. The sequence was logical and reproducible. It worked in mathematics. It worked in combat. It worked in life. The manual fuel pump modification exists today in aviation museums as a footnote to P-51D operational history. Docents describe it briefly while explaining the aircraft's fuel system. Visitors nod and move on to more dramatic exhibits. Nobody asks about the first pilot who used it, or the hand injuries sustained during 3 hours of continuous operation, or the mathematics that defined the margin between survival and death. Those details aren't dramatic enough for public memory. History preserves the modification, but forgets the desperation that created it. That amnesia is natural and probably necessary. Wars produce thousands of small innovations driven by immediate survival needs. Most vanish when the crisis passes. A few persist long enough to enter doctrine. Fewer still survive the transition from doctrine to institutional memory. Hayes's modification survived through the end of the war, then faded as jet engines and improved fuel systems made manual backup pumps obsolete. The knowledge that survival sometimes required bleeding hands and broken levers and calculations made while FW-190s dived through your formation. That knowledge died with the pilots who'd lived it. The modifications they'd built, and the pain they'd accepted, and the fear they'd managed through mathematics, all of it became historical footnote. Clean, distant, safe. The messiness of creation erased by the cleanliness of documentation. What remains is this. On March 6, 1945, Captain Robert Hayes flew a P-51D Mustang 1,600 miles to Berlin and back on a fuel system that failed catastrophically over enemy territory. He maintained fuel pressure manually for 3 hours and 14 minutes, using a backup pump he'd installed without authorization. He landed with 1 gallon of fuel remaining and a hand opened to the bone. He filed a report. Engineers analyzed the modification. Command authorized implementation. 637 aircraft received the upgrade. 47 pilots survived fuel pump failures that would have killed them under the previous system. The war ended. Hayes went home. He taught mathematics to high school students for 43 years. He never discussed the modification in detail. When asked about his war service, he said he'd flown fighters in Europe. That was accurate and sufficient. The rest, the bleeding and the fear and the calculations made at 30,000 feet while the fuel gauge fell toward empty, those experiences belonged to him alone. They shaped his understanding of survival and systems and the mathematics that connected the two. But they didn't transfer. Experience rarely does. Each generation learns its own lessons under conditions previous generations can't fully explain. Hayes understood this. He taught mathematics because mathematics was universal and transferable. The theorems worked regardless of who applied them. The lessons from combat were personal and conditional, and ultimately incommunicable. He could describe what he'd done. He couldn't convey why it had mattered in the moment, or what it felt like when the fuel pressure gauge dropped and the engine coughed, and the only thing standing between survival and death was a crude hand pump and the willingness to keep operating it after the lever broke. Those feelings belonged to March 6, 1945. They existed in that specific time and place and context. They couldn't be extracted and preserved. They could only be remembered. And eventually, when the people who'd lived them died, forgotten. So here's the question worth asking. If you'd been in that cockpit on March 6, 1945, with a failed fuel pump and 800 miles of enemy territory below, and a crude backup system you'd built without permission, would you have kept pumping? Would you have gripped the broken shaft with a bleeding hand and worked it up and down for 3 hours until the coast appeared and the fuel gauge read 1 gallon and the runway appeared ahead? Or would you have looked at the math, recognized the margins were too thin, and chosen the bailout? There's no wrong answer. Survival and surrender are both rational responses to impossible situations. Hayes chose survival. He chose it through preparation, through calculation, and through the willingness to operate broken equipment with a broken hand until the mathematics resolved. That choice defined his war and defined the 47 pilots who survived after him using the modification he'd created. The choice couldn't be made for him by command or doctrine or engineering analysis. It had to be made alone in a cockpit at 30,000 feet while the fuel gauge fell and the alternative clarified into capture or death. He made it. Others made it after him. The modification that enabled that choice existed because Hayes had broken regulations and worked through midnight and installed a backup system that command insisted wasn't necessary, until it was, until the electric fuel pump failed and the backup became the only thing keeping the engine running. Then it wasn't unnecessary. Then it was survival. The difference between those two states, unnecessary and survival, occupied the space between preparation and crisis. Hayes had lived in that space. He'd built the modification there, and when crisis arrived, the preparation held. That's the lesson buried in technical documentation and forgotten by history. Prepare for the crisis before the crisis demands it. Build the backup when nobody thinks you need it. Calculate the margins when the margins seem comfortable, because eventually, probability catches up. Systems fail, margins collapse, and the only thing standing between survival and death is the work you did when nobody was watching, and nobody authorized it, and nobody believed it mattered. Hayes did that work. The modification proved him right. The 47 pilots who survived proved the modification necessary. And the math, clean and absolute and indifferent to emotion, confirmed what Hayes had known all along. Redundancy saves lives when primary systems fail. The question is whether you'll build the redundancy before you need it, or wait until the fuel gauge reads empty, and the engine coughs, and the coast is still 13 minutes away, and you've got nothing left except a broken hand pump and the willingness to keep bleeding until the runway appears beneath your wings. Think about that the next time someone tells you a backup system is unnecessary.